Marcus Trent sat in his office, fingers drumming anxiously on the mahogany desk. The events of the previous night played through his mind like a surreal nightmare. He could still feel the sting of the officer's fist against his jaw, the cold bite of metal as handcuffs tightened around his wrists. The irony wasn't lost on him, the mayor of the city, arrested by the very force he oversaw. As he stared out the window at the bustling city below, Marcus couldn't shake the burning anger that rose in his chest. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm him. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every citizen who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Michael Trent adjusted his tie, glancing at his watch as he waited outside the boutique. The sleek storefront stood silent and dark, a stark contrast to its usual daytime bustle. As mayor, Michael was accustomed to late nights, but this evening felt different. The quiet street, normally a symbol of the city's progress, now held an unsettling stillness. Dim streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Michael shifted his weight, feeling the fatigue of a long day settling into his bones. His tailored suit, usually a source of confidence, felt restrictive in the cool night air. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, betraying his growing impatience. He had arranged to meet his wife here after her late-night flight, planning to surprise her with a carefully selected gift. As the minutes ticked by, Michael's anticipation began to give way to unease. His eyes scanned the empty street, taking in the familiar sights that now seemed strangely alien in the late-night hours. Even in these quiet moments, the weight of his responsibilities never truly left him. He thought about the upcoming council meeting, mentally rehearsing his talking points on the new police reform proposals. Little did he know how personal that issue was about to become. The silence of the night was broken by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Michael checked his watch again, the glowing face showing it was well past midnight. He pulled out his phone, considering whether to call his wife, when a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. For a moment, Michael thought he glimpsed a figure moving in the darkness. His heart rate quickened, a mix of anticipation and apprehension coursing through him. The faint sound of footsteps reached his ears, growing steadily louder. The rhythmic tapping echoed off the buildings, creating an unsettling ambience in the once peaceful night. As the footsteps drew nearer, Michael could make out the heavy tread of boots on concrete. The sound was too forceful, too deliberate to be his wife's elegant stride. A sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach, his mayoral instincts warning him that something was amiss. He turned fully towards the approaching sound, squaring his shoulders and attempting to project an air of calm authority. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by the faint jingle of metal. Michael's eyes strained in the dim light, trying to make out the approaching figure. As the person stepped into a pool of lamplight, the mayor caught a glimpse of a dark uniform and the glint of a badge. A police officer was approaching, his gait purposeful and his hand resting near his belt. In that moment, as their eyes met across the shadowy street, Michael felt a shift in the air. The night that had started like any other was about to take a turn that would shake the foundations of his city and challenge everything he thought he knew about justice and equality. As the officer's silhouette emerged from the shadows, Michael's instincts screamed danger. The gruff voice cut through the silence. "Hey, you. What are you doing here?" The officer's words carried a sharp edge of suspicion, his tone immediately confrontational. As he stepped into the pool of light, Michael could see the officer's stance, feet planted firmly apart, shoulders squared, one hand resting near his belt. Michael took a deep breath. "Good evening, officer," he replied, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "I'm just waiting for my wife. She's flying in late, and I wanted to surprise her with a gift from this boutique." The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning Michael from head to toe. His gaze lingered on Michael's expensive suit. "Pretty late to be hanging around closed stores, don't you think?" he pressed, taking a step closer. "I understand how it might look," Michael said, fighting to keep his tone even. "But I assure you, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm actually the May." "I didn't ask for your life story," the officer interrupted. "Let's see some ID." Michael's heart sank. He recognized the pattern unfolding before him, the automatic suspicion, the dismissal of his explanations. He reached slowly for his wallet, hyper-aware of the officer's hand still hovering near his weapon. "Of course, officer," Michael said, carefully extracting his ID. "I want to cooperate fully." The officer snatched the ID, barely glancing at it before firing off another question. "What's in your pockets? Any weapons I should know about?" "No, sir. No weapons. Just my phone and keys." The officer's eyes darted around the empty street, his posture growing more rigid. "You expect me to believe you're just standing out here in the middle of the night for no reason? What are you really up to?" Michael could sense the officer's growing agitation. He took a deep breath, trying to project an air of calm he didn't feel. "Officer, I know this looks suspicious, but I promise you, there's a simple explanation. If you'd just let me." Hands where I can see them, the officer barked suddenly, his own hand now resting on his holster. "Stop reaching for your pockets." Michael froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't even realized he'd been moving his hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." I said, "Hands up." The officer's voice cracked like a whip, echoing off the silent storefronts. As Michael slowly raised his hands, palms out in a gesture of compliance, he realized the full gravity of the situation. The officer wasn't seeing Michael Trent, respected mayor and community leader. He was seeing a threat, a potential criminal, based on nothing more than his own biases and the color of Michael's skin. The night air seemed to crackle with tension as the two men stood facing each other. Michael knew that his next words could either diffuse the situation or ignite a powder keg of misunderstanding and prejudice. As he opened his mouth to speak, he silently prayed that reason would prevail over fear and bias. Michael locked eyes with the officer, realizing this confrontation represented a much larger societal problem. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, his gaze sweeping over Michael's tailored suit with evident suspicion. The contrast between Michael's attire and the dimly lit street seemed to fuel the officer's misgivings. Anxiety and frustration coursed through Michael's veins, but he forced himself to remain composed. Years of political training had prepared him for tense situations, yet this encounter was pushing him to his limits. "You still haven't explained what you're really doing here," the officer growled. "Nice suit like that, hanging around clothes stores? Seems pretty suspicious to me." Michael fought to keep his voice steady. "Officer, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, there's nothing suspicious happening here. I'm simply waiting for my wife. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the May." "Save it," the officer cut him off, stepping closer. "I've heard every excuse in the book. You don't belong here, and we both know it." The coded language hit Michael like a slap. He felt a flicker of anger ignite in his chest, threatening his carefully maintained composure. "With all due respect," Officer Michael said, his voice taking on a firmer edge, "I have every right to be here. I'm a law-abiding citizen, and I've done nothing wrong. Your assumptions about me are baseless and inappropriate." The officer's posture stiffened, his hand now resting fully on his weapon. "Watch your tone," he warned. "You're looking more and more like trouble every second. Maybe we need to take this conversation down to the station." Michael straightened his back, meeting the officer's gaze with determination. "Officer, I want to be clear. I have cooperated fully with your questions, despite their inappropriate nature. I am asserting my rights as a citizen, and I do not consent to any further questioning or detainment without cause." The tension in the air thickened, the space between them charged with unspoken hostility. The officer's face twisted into a snarl. "You think you know the law? I'll show you what happens to smart-mouthed troublemakers who don't know their place." Michael's mind raced, weighing his options. He could feel the situation spiraling out of control, the officer's bias pushing them towards a dangerous confrontation. Part of him wanted to back down, but a stronger voice inside him refused to be silenced. With tensions running high and the eyes of the nation turning to their city, the stage was set for a reckoning. As Mayor Trent prepared to address his constituents, the police department faced its own internal crisis. The coming days would test the fabric of the city's institutions and the resolve of its leaders. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the status quo was no longer an option. The police precinct buzzed with nervous energy as officers grappled with the fallout from Mason's actions. Officer Rodriguez approached Mason, his face a mask of disappointment. "What were you thinking, man?" he asked, his voice low but intense. "You've put us all in a difficult position." Mason looked up, his eyes hollow with regret. I don't know," he stammered. "It all happened so fast. I thought he was suspicious, and then you assaulted the mayor," Rodriguez finished, shaking his head. Across the room, a heated debate unfolded between two veteran officers. "We need to stand by our own officer," Johnson argued. "Mason made a mistake, but he was doing his job." "Since when is profiling and assaulting innocent citizens part of our job description?" Officer Chen countered. In his office, Police Chief Ramirez felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since news of the incident broke. He called his leadership team together, their faces grim, as they gathered around the conference table. "We need to act swiftly and decisively," Ramirez began, his voice steady despite the turmoil. "This incident has shaken public trust in our department to its core. I'm placing Mason on immediate suspension pending a full internal investigation." As word of Mason's suspension spread, reactions were mixed. Some officers nodded in grim approval, while others muttered about loyalty and hasty judgments. Mason sat alone, head in his hands, as the reality of his situation sank in. The camaraderie he had once felt with his fellow officers had evaporated, replaced by a sense of isolation and shame. Chief Ramirez emerged from his office, addressing the assembled officers. "I know this is a difficult time for all of us," he said. "But we have a responsibility to our community. In the coming days, we will be implementing new training programs and reviewing our policies. This is an opportunity for us to do better, to be better." As the chief's words sank in, a mix of apprehension and resolve settled over the precinct. The road ahead would be challenging, but there was a growing recognition that change was necessary. Meanwhile, across town, Mayor Trent prepared to address the city. The reverberations of that fateful night were about to reshape not just the police department, but the entire community. As the sun set on a day of turmoil, the stage was set for a reckoning that would test the resolve of leaders and citizens alike. Mayor Michael Trent approached the podium at the emergency city council meeting, his presence commanding immediate attention. The packed chamber fell silent as he began to speak, his voice carrying a weight that belied the visible marks of his recent encounter with police brutality. "Distinguished council members, fellow citizens," he began. "What happened to me last night is a stark reminder of the systemic issues plaguing our police force and our community at large." Michael recounted the events of that fateful night, his vivid description painting a picture of fear, confusion, and injustice that resonated throughout the room. As he transitioned from his personal experience to broader issues, Michael's voice rose with passion. "This isn't about me alone. It's about every citizen who has ever felt targeted, profiled, or mistreated by those sworn to protect and serve. It's about the broken trust between our community and our law enforcement." Michael outlined his proposed reforms, focusing on concrete actions rather than rhetoric. "We must establish an independent oversight committee," he declared, "a body with the power to review police conduct and ensure true accountability." He emphasized the need for mandatory de-escalation training and a public reporting system for complaints against officers. Councilwoman Martinez raised concerns about the pace of change, but Michael stood firm. "With all due respect, Councilwoman, we've been studying this issue for years. How many more incidents do we need before we take decisive action?" As the debate intensified, Michael skillfully wove his personal ordeal into a broader narrative of community suffering and the urgent need for change. The council members listened intently, their expressions a mix of concern, thoughtfulness, and, in some cases, discomfort. "We stand at a crossroads," Michael concluded, his voice resonating with conviction. "We can choose to maintain the status quo, or we can seize this moment to create real, meaningful change. The choice is ours, and the eyes of our community, and indeed, the nation, are upon us." A heavy silence fell over the chamber as Michael stepped back from the podium. The council members exchanged glances, the weight of the decision before them evident in their expressions. After a tense moment, Council President Thompson cleared his throat. "In light of recent events, and Mayor Trent's compelling argument, I move that we vote on the proposed police reform measures immediately." A chorus of ayes filled the chamber, setting in motion a process that would reshape the city's approach to law enforcement and community relations. As the council prepared to vote, Michael stood quietly, his determination evident in every line of his posture. The city held its breath, waiting to see how these proposed changes would be received by a public already divided on issues of policing and racial equality. As word of the council's deliberations spread, a new energy gripped the city. Protesters filled the streets, their chants for justice echoing off the buildings. The air crackled with tension as diverse groups converged on City Hall, each driven by their own vision of reform. Young activists held signs reading "Defund the Police" and "Black Lives Matter," their faces a mix of determination and hope. Across the street, police supporters waved thin blue-line flags. The atmosphere was electric, a tinderbox of emotions waiting for a spark. Police officers lined the perimeter, their faces taut with tension as they watched the growing crowds. Community organizer Maria Rodriguez spoke passionately to a group of reporters. "This is about dismantling a system that perpetuates injustice," she declared, her voice carrying over the din. "We've been saying this for years, and now maybe people will finally listen." Retired police officer James Thompson offered a different perspective. "We can't let a single incident overshadow the good work that most officers do every day," he argued. "Reform is necessary, but we need to be careful about how we proceed." As the day wore on, the diversity of opinions became increasingly apparent. Some called for a complete overhaul of the police department, while others advocated for more moderate changes. The proposed reforms had sparked intense debate, forcing citizens to confront long-held beliefs about law enforcement and community safety. Local business owner Sarah Chen watched the protests from her shop window, her expression a mix of concern and hope. "I want to see change," she admitted, "but I'm worried about what this unrest might mean for our community. We need to find a way forward that addresses the real issues without tearing the city apart." The pressure on city officials to act quickly was mounting. Mayor Trent's reform proposals had opened a Pandora's box of long-suppressed grievances and aspirations. Each hour that passed without concrete action seemed to heighten the tension in the streets. As night fell, the potential for clashes between protesters and counter-protesters grew. Police officers formed lines between the opposing groups, their faces grim as they worked to maintain order. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone acutely aware that a single misstep could ignite a powder keg of emotions. Community mediator Dr. Alicia Patel reflected on the challenges ahead. "What we're seeing is a city grappling with deep-seated issues that have no easy solutions," she observed. "The road to meaningful reform will be long and difficult, but this moment of crisis also presents an opportunity for real change." The city stood at a crossroads, its future hanging in the balance. As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of a new day, one thing was certain: the voices of the people, in all their complexity and contradiction, would play a crucial role in shaping the path ahead. The question now was how city leaders, including the police union, would respond to this groundswell of public sentiment. The next move in this high-stakes game of reform was about to be made, and the whole city held its breath in anticipation. As dawn broke over the city, a new storm was brewing. The police union president's face flushed with anger as he prepared to address the media. His words would ignite a firestorm of controversy, pitting officer against citizen, leader against follower. The police union headquarters buzzed with frantic activity. Union representatives huddled in small groups, their faces etched with concern and determination. The proposed reforms had sent shockwaves through the department, and the union was preparing to mount a defense of its members. Union President Frank Callahan stepped up to the podium, his jaw clenched and eyes blazing. "This is an attack on the brave men and women who put their lives on the line every day to keep our city safe," he began, his voice tight with barely contained rage. Callahan defended Officer Mason, portraying him as a dedicated public servant caught in an impossible situation. Officer Mason was following protocol in a potentially dangerous situation. The mayor's accusations and push for reforms undermine the foundation of law and order in our city. The union's public statements were carefully crafted to appeal to citizens' fears about crime and public safety. They painted a picture of a city overrun by lawlessness if the reforms were implemented. "Who will you call when you're in danger?" one union spokesperson asked. "These reforms will leave our officers second-guessing every decision, putting your safety at risk." As news of the union's resistance spread, tensions in the city ratcheted up another notch. Supporters of police reform took to social media, decrying the union's stance as tone-deaf and out of touch. Meanwhile, those sympathetic to law enforcement rallied behind the union, praising them for standing up to what they saw as political overreach. The stage was set for a showdown between Mayor Trent and the police union. Both sides seemed entrenched in their positions, with little room for compromise. The city held its breath, wondering how this clash of wills would play out and what it would mean for the future of policing in their community. Even as the union dug in its heels, cracks were beginning to appear in their united front. Some younger officers, moved by the public outcry and their own experiences, began to question the wisdom of blanket resistance to reform. These voices were quickly silenced within the ranks, but their doubts lingered, a harbinger of the challenges the union would face in maintaining solidarity. As the day wore on, it became clear that the police union's response to Mayor Trent's call for accountability was one of unequivocal opposition. They had drawn a line in the sand, positioning themselves as the last line of defense against what they viewed as dangerous and misguided reforms. The battle lines were drawn, and the city braced itself for a protracted fight over the future of its police force. Little did anyone know, however, that unexpected allies were about to emerge in support of reform, shifting the balance of power in ways no one could have predicted. As the sun set on a day of heightened tensions, the stage was set for a new act in the city's unfolding drama of change and resistance. The press conference room fell silent as Jonathan Reeves, CEO of TechInnovate Solutions, began to speak. His words carried weight, not just as a business leader, but as someone about to take a controversial stand. As a business leader, I understand the importance of stability and order, he said, his voice steady. But I also recognize that true stability can only come from a foundation of justice and equality. That's why I'm here today to support Mayor Trent's police reform proposals. The assembled reporters erupted into a frenzy of questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief. Reeves raised his hand, calling for quiet. This is about creating a city where all our employees, regardless of their background, feel safe and valued. Reform is a moral imperative, and it's good for business. As news of Reeves' endorsement spread, other allies emerged from unexpected quarters. Dr. Emily Chen, the city's most renowned surgeon, held an impromptu press conference outside the hospital. As someone who has dedicated my life to healing, I cannot stay silent in the face of systemic injustice, she declared. These reforms are crucial to addressing the public health crisis of police violence. Reverend Michael Thompson, leader of the city's largest evangelical congregation, surprised many of his conservative followers by voicing his support. Our faith calls us to stand up for the oppressed and to seek justice, he said during his Sunday sermon. We cannot ignore the cries of our brothers and sisters who have suffered under an unjust system. These allies brought more than just their voices to the cause. They brought resources, influence, and access to networks that had previously been closed to reform advocates. The city's power dynamics began to shift, with traditional alliances fracturing and new coalitions forming around the issue of police reform. Mayor Trent, still nursing his physical and emotional wounds, found himself at the center of a growing movement. The support from these quarters gave him renewed energy and determination. In a statement to the press, he said, "I'm humbled and inspired by the diverse voices joining our call for change. This is about building a safer, more just city for all our residents." The police union, caught off guard by this turn of events, scrambled to respond. Their attempts to paint the reformers as fringe radicals fell flat in the face of support from respected community leaders. Some rank-and-file officers, seeing the broad coalition forming in favor of reform, began to question the union's hardline stance. As the momentum behind the reform movement grew, so did the anticipation for what these new alliances might achieve. Community organizers found themselves working alongside corporate executives and religious leaders. The shared goal of creating a more equitable police force bridged divides that had seemed insurmountable just days before. Yet, even as hope for meaningful change blossomed, challenges loomed on the horizon. The entrenched interests opposing reform were not going to go down without a fight. The coming weeks would test the strength and resolve of these newfound alliances. For Mayor Trent, the growing support intensified the pressure on him to deliver results. As he prepared for another round of meetings and negotiations, the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon him. The bruises on his face were fading, but the emotional scars of that fateful night remained fresh. Each public appearance, each retelling of his ordeal, reopened wounds that were struggling to heal. As the mayor retreated to his office after another long day, the personal toll of leading this fight for reform was becoming increasingly apparent. Mayor Michael Trent stood at the window of his spacious office, the city skyline stretching before him. His fingers brushed against the fading bruise on his jaw, a constant reminder of the injustice he had faced. The physical pain had subsided, but the emotional impact lingered. Michael's eyes fell on a framed photo of his family. He picked it up, studying their smiling faces. The incident had affected them all. His wife, Sarah, had been his rock, but worry etched her face each time he left for work. Their children, once carefree, now asked pointed questions about police and safety. A recent family dinner flashed in Michael's mind. His teenage daughter's voice had trembled as she asked Dad, "Are you really safe out there?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Michael had fought to keep his voice steady as he reassured her, grappling with his own doubts. As he set the photo down, Michael caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back seemed older, more careworn. Every public appearance now came with heightened scrutiny, every word analyzed by supporters and critics alike. The newfound notoriety exposed him and his family to overwhelming public attention. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from his oldest friend, David. "Hanging in there, champ? Don't forget, we've got your back." The simple message brought a small smile to his face, a reminder of his support network. Despite the personal toll, Michael's determination to effect real change in the city's policing practices had only grown stronger. His experience had reshaped his approach to leadership. He found himself listening more intently to those who had faced similar injustices, understanding their pain in a way he never could have before. As Michael prepared to leave his office, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The personal struggles he faced were significant, but he carried with him the hope that his experience could pave the way for meaningful reform. All across town, preparations were already underway for the implementation of new police training programs. These programs, born from the crucible of Michael's personal ordeal, would soon begin to reshape the nature of law enforcement in the city. As the mayor walked towards his next meeting, the seeds of change he had planted were about to take root, promising a new era of policing and community relations. As the seeds of change Mayor Trent had planted were about to take root, a different kind of tension was building across town. In a stuffy conference room, seasoned officers shifted uneasily, their faces a mix of skepticism and barely concealed hostility. Dr. Angela Martinez, a renowned expert in implicit bias and de-escalation techniques, stood at the front of the room, her voice calm but authoritative. "Gentlemen, I know many of you are wondering why you're here today," she began. "The events of the past few weeks have made it clear that we need to re-examine our approach to policing in this city." A low murmur rippled through the room. Officer Johnson, a 20-year veteran, leaned over to his partner. "This is bull," he muttered. "We don't need some egghead telling us how to do our jobs." Dr. Martinez continued, undeterred. "We'll be focusing on communication skills, active listening, and empathy. These tools are essential for reducing tensions in potentially volatile situations." As she introduced the first role-playing scenario, the resistance in the room was palpable. Officers exchanged skeptical glances, arms crossed defensively. When Dr. Martinez asked for volunteers, the silence was deafening. Finally, a young officer named Rodriguez raised his hand. "I'll give it a shot," he said, ignoring the disapproving looks from some of his colleagues. As Rodriguez worked through the scenario with a trained actor, a few other officers began to pay closer attention. The simulation was more challenging than they had anticipated, forcing Rodriguez to confront his own biases and assumptions in real time. "That's good, Officer Rodriguez," Dr. Martinez encouraged. "Now let's discuss how your approach might have been influenced by implicit biases." The discussion that followed was heated but productive. Some officers remained resistant, but others were beginning to see the value in the training. Officer Chen spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "You know, I never realized how much my own assumptions might be affecting my interactions on the job." As the day wore on, Dr. Martinez introduced more complex scenarios and discussions. The officers grappled with topics like racial profiling, the impact of historical injustices on community police relations, and the importance of treating all individuals with respect, regardless of appearance. By the end of the session, Dr. Martinez outlined the full scope of the new training programs. "This is just the beginning," she explained. "Over the next few months, you'll be participating in regular workshops, community engagement sessions, and ongoing evaluations." As the officers filed out of the room, the atmosphere was charged with a mix of emotions. Some remained skeptical, others felt overwhelmed by the changes ahead. But there was also a growing sense of possibility, a recognition that these new approaches could lead to better outcomes for both officers and the communities they served. Outside the training center, Chief Ramirez watched the officers leave, his face etched with determination. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that changing the culture of an entire department would take time and face resistance. But as he reflected on the events that had led to this moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. The seeds of change were beginning to sprout, promising a new era of policing that prioritized understanding, empathy, and true community service. The community center buzzed with tension as residents and police officers gathered for their first engagement session. Months of preparation had led to this moment, aimed at bridging the divide between law enforcement and the community they served. Officer Rodriguez felt his palms sweat as he scanned the room, recognizing faces from his neighborhood patrols. As the facilitator began, initial exchanges were stilted and awkward. Residents spoke of years feeling targeted and misunderstood, their voices tinged with anger and hurt. Officers struggled to find the right words, their training on active listening put to the test in real time. Gradually, small breakthroughs emerged. A longtime resident shared a story of a positive interaction with an officer during a family crisis, her voice softening as she described the compassion she'd encountered. An officer opened up about the challenges he faced on the job, humanizing the badge in a way many residents had never considered. These moments of connection, though fragile, sparked innovative approaches to community policing. A youth mentorship program paired officers with local teenagers, fostering relationships beyond law enforcement contexts. Community-led safety initiatives empowered residents to work alongside officers in addressing neighborhood concerns. Officer Chen found herself looking forward to her shifts in a new way. The faces on her beat were no longer just potential threats or victims, but neighbors with names and stories. She'd struck up a friendship with MS Johnson, the community garden organizer, often stopping by to chat during her patrols. As months turned into years, the impact of these changes became increasingly evident. Crime rates began to decline as community members felt more comfortable reporting issues and collaborating with police. Officers reported higher job satisfaction and lower stress levels. The US versus them mentality that had long defined police-community relations was slowly giving way to a sense of shared responsibility for public safety. Mayor Trent prepared for a press conference marking the 3rd anniversary of the incident that had sparked these changes. The bruises on his face had long since faded, but the memory of that night remained vivid. It had been a catalyst, setting in motion a reimagining of policing in their city. As Michael reviewed the latest community satisfaction surveys and police performance reports, he felt a surge of cautious optimism. The seeds of change planted in the aftermath of his personal ordeal had taken root, growing into a new era of policing built on mutual respect and understanding. Mayor Trent stepped up to the podium, ready to share his vision for the next phase of this ongoing transformation, knowing that the eyes of the nation would be watching their city's experiment in police reform. Mayor Michael Trent stood before his city, a living testament to the power of change. As he approached the podium, a hush fell over the diverse crowd gathered in the city square. The memory of that fateful night 3 years ago still burned bright in his mind, but the scars had faded. Michael's eyes scanned the faces before him, a tapestry of cultures and backgrounds reflecting the complex fabric of the community he served. 3 years ago, Michael began, his voice steady and clear, "I stood before you as a victim of the very system I had sworn to uphold. Today, I stand before you as a changed man, leading a changed city." He paused, letting the words sink in. But change is not a destination. It's an ongoing journey, one that requires constant vigilance, reflection, and action. Michael highlighted the city's progress, new police training programs, community oversight committees, and improved relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. Each accomplishment spoke to the collective effort of citizens, activists, and forward-thinking officials who had refused to accept the status quo. Yet he was careful not to sugarcoat the challenges that remained. "We have made great strides," he said, his voice taking on a more somber tone, "but we must not become complacent. The work of building a truly just and equitable society is never finished." As he outlined his vision for the future, Michael's voice grew more impassioned. He described expanded community policing initiatives, increased diversity in police recruitment, and innovative programs to address the root causes of crime and social unrest. The crowd listened intently, sensing the mayor's genuine commitment to long-term, systemic change. Michael's personal ordeal had reshaped his approach to leadership. He spoke with a new level of empathy, drawing connections between policy decisions and their real-world impact on individuals and communities. The concepts of justice and equality had become deeply personal, infusing his governance with urgency and purpose. "My experience opened my eyes to realities that many in our community have faced for generations," Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. "It taught me that true leadership means implementing policies and amplifying the voices of those who have been marginalized and silenced." As he concluded his speech, Michael issued a call to action. "The changes we've made, the progress we've achieved, none of it would have been possible without your courage, your persistence, and your belief in a better future. But our work is far from over. We must continue to challenge our assumptions, confront uncomfortable truths, and work tirelessly to build a city where justice and equality are realities for every resident." The crowd erupted into applause as Michael stepped back from the podium. He felt a mix of pride in how far they had come and determination for the journey ahead. The city's transformation had become a blueprint for change, watched closely by communities across the nation grappling with similar issues. As the anniversary event drew to a close, the air buzzed with energy and anticipation. Mayor Michael Trent's reflections had ignited a renewed commitment to the ongoing work of reform and reconciliation. The city stood poised on the brink of a new chapter, ready to face the challenges ahead with hard-won wisdom and unwavering resolve. Marcus Jones gripped the steering wheel, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm. The day at City Hall had been grueling, filled with endless meetings and weighty decisions. As he approached the intersection, flashing blue and red lights pierced the twilight. Marcus's heart sank. He hadn't broken any laws, yet here he was, pulling over to the side of the road. The police cruiser parked behind him, its headlights flooding his rearview mirror. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He knew that this moment, seemingly insignificant, was part of a larger pattern, one that affected countless lives across the city. As he waited for the officer to approach, Marcus reflected on the words of Brian Stevenson, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." The phrase echoed in his mind, a reminder of the complex humanity behind every interaction, every decision made in the halls of power. The incident unfolding on this quiet street was more than just a traffic stop. It was a microcosm of the challenges facing their community, the need for accountability, for understanding, for change. Marcus knew that true progress wouldn't come from grand gestures or impassioned speeches alone. It required sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and a willingness to confront deep-rooted issues. As the officer's footsteps drew nearer, Marcus steeled himself. Whatever happened next, he was determined to approach it with the same dedication he brought to his work at City Hall. The path to a more just society was long and winding, but it began with moments like these, moments of tension, of possibility, of potential transformation.